Hello. Tonight we gather in the quiet hours to walk together through the shadowed corridors of Slavic mythology. Not a single grand epic survives in the words of those who once lived it. Not a sacred book handed down through generations. Instead, we face a vast silence, a faith that spoke mostly through ritual, through the rhythm of seasons, through carved wood and whispered offerings rather than ink. Tonight's journey begins here, at the very edge of what can be known, because understanding Slavic mythology means first accepting how much has been lost and how patiently we must listen to what remains. Imagine the wide steppes and dense northern forests stretching under low grey skies, where people lived close to the earth for centuries without committing their deepest beliefs to parchment. The ancient Slavs did not develop a writing system of their own until much later, long after their neighbours, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, had already filled libraries with their observations. When the Slavs finally adopted script, it came hand in hand with Christianity, and the old ways were recorded mostly by those who sought to replace them. That absence of native voices creates the first layer of mystery. We are left to reconstruct a worldview from echoes, from the remarks of outsiders who passed through, from fragments buried in soil, and from the stubborn survival of customs long after their meaning was officially forgotten. Our earliest glimpse comes from the 6th century, carried in the pages of Procopius of Caesarea, a Byzantine historian who chronicled the wars of Justinian. He described the Slavs living north of the Danube as worshippers of a single thunder god, to whom they sacrificed cattle and performed divinations by watching the flight of horses. His account is brief, almost incidental, yet it already captures something essential, a reverence for the powers of sky and storm. Procopius wrote as an outsider looking across a frontier, curious but distant, and his words remain one of the oldest written traces we have. Several centuries later, Arab travellers added their own observations. Al-Masudi, in the 10th century, journeyed through Slavic lands and recorded stories of a people who venerated fire and held solemn feasts in honor of their deities. He noted their belief in a supreme being who ruled over lightning and thunder, and he described wooden idols placed in sacred groves. Like Procopius, Al-Masudi saw the Slavs from the outside, a merchant and geographer passing through trade routes. Yet his notes preserve details that would otherwise have vanished entirely. Closer to home, Christian chroniclers from the German lands provide some of the richest, though most hostile, testimony. Theotmar of Merseburg, writing in the early 11th century, described the elaborate temples and richly adorned statues of the Palabian Slavs along the Baltic coast. He spoke of their oracles, their sacrificial rites, and their stubborn resistance to conversion. A generation later, Helmold of Bosau continued the record, painting vivid pictures of wooden sanctuaries filled with multiple-headed idols and of priests who guarded sacred springs and groves. These German bishops wrote during active missionary campaigns and crusades. Their words carry the weight of conflict. Yet they also document a living pagan world that still flourished when much of Europe had already turned toward the cross. Only after the year 980 do we hear something closer to a Slavic voice. The primary chronicle, compiled in Kievan Rus and traditionally attributed to the monk Nestor, describes how Prince Vladimir, before his own baptism, erected a pantheon of wooden idols on a hill above the Dnieper. There stood Perun, with his silver head and golden moustache, Khors, Dazhbog, Stribog, Simagl, and the only goddess among them, Mokosh. The chronicle lists their names and briefly notes their domains, then recounts how Vladimir ordered the idols cast down and the river baptized in their place. It is the closest thing we have to an official Slavic catalogue of gods, yet even this comes from a Christian compiler who viewed the old faith as something to be supplanted. Beyond texts, the earth itself has yielded clues. The Zerbruch idol, a tall stone figure unearthed in the 19th century near the Zerbruch River, stands as one of the most striking archaeological witnesses. Carved on 4 sides, it shows a bearded warrior above, women with raised hands in the middle register, and a monstrous face below, perhaps representing the three realms of the Slavic cosmos. Similar stone and wooden figures, sacrificial pits filled with animal bones, and traces of ritual fires have been found across the Slavic world, silent proof that these beliefs once shaped daily life. Linguists have traced the names of gods and spirits through place names, personal names, and the vocabulary of modern Slavic languages, revealing deep Indo-European roots shared with Baltic, Germanic, and even Indic traditions. Ethnographers in the 19th and 20th centuries collected songs, tales, and seasonal customs from remote villages, where fragments of pre-Christian practice lingered under layers of Orthodox ritual. By carefully comparing these scattered pieces, chronicles, archaeology, linguistics, folklore scholars have learned to reconstruct what was never written down in full. So the Slavic mythological tradition is not truly lost, it is dispersed, like ash carried on the wind across centuries and borders. Every source is partial, every fragment tinged with the perspective of its recorder, yet together they allow us to sense the shape of something vast and ancient. We approach it not with the certainty of possession, but with the quiet respect one gives to a half-remembered dream. As we sit here in the stillness, picture a single oak standing alone on a low hill at twilight, its branches reaching toward the first stars, while its roots disappear into dark earth. Around its trunk people once gathered, leaving small offerings of bread and mead, speaking words now impossible to recover. That tree is gone, yet something of those gatherings still lingers in the stories we are about to follow. That solitary oak on the hill, standing through dusk into the first pale light of morning, was never merely a tree to the people who gathered beneath it. For the ancient Slavs, the world itself was structured like a great living tree, its roots plunging into unseen depths, its trunk steady through the human realm, its branches lifting toward the unreachable sky. This image of the world tree was not unique to them. Echoes appear in Norse tales of Yggdrasil, in Siberian shamanic visions, in distant Indo-European memories. But for the Slavs, it carried a particular quiet gravity. It was the axis around which everything turned, the silent pillar holding heaven, earth, and the underworld in delicate vertical alignment. Picture yourself standing at the base of such a tree in the hour before dawn. The ground is still cool and damp from the night, moss soft underfoot, the faint smell of wet bark and decaying leaves rising with each breath. Far above, the highest branches disappear into mist or catch the first thin gold of sunrise. Below, the roots spread unseen, gripping soil that has drunk the blood of sacrifices and the tears of the departed. Between these extremes stretches the visible world fields, rivers, villages, the paths people walk every day. The tree does not stand apart from life. It is life, connecting what can be seen with what cannot. Scholars who have pieced together Slavic cosmology most often describe three principal realms stacked along this vertical axis. At the top lies Prav, the domain of heavenly order, truth, and divine law. It is the place where the cosmic principles reside, where the gods who maintain balance hold their counsel, where the sun follows its appointed path and the stars keep their unchanging courses. Prav is not a paradise of pleasure, but a realm of perfect structure, the blueprint against which the rest of existence is measured. In the middle stands Yav, the manifest, tangible world, the one we inhabit. Here the seasons turn, crops rise and fail, children are born, battles are fought, fires are lit in hearths. Yav is the plane of ordinary experience, bright with daylight and shadowed by night, alive with movement and change. It is the only realm fully open to human senses, yet even here the presence of the higher and lower worlds is felt constantly. In the sudden storm that breaks a drought, in the dream that warns of danger, in the unexplained sickness that takes a child. Beneath lies Nav, the underworld, the realm of the dead, of ancestors, of hidden forces, and forgotten things. Nav is not simply a place of punishment or horror, it is the reservoir of potential, the source from which new life eventually returns. Rivers flow there, sometimes imagined as the same waters that circle the living world, and the souls of the departed dwell in a kind of twilight existence, still linked to their descendants through offerings and memory. Nav is cold, dark, wet, yet it is also fertile. Seeds sleep there before sprouting. The dead wait there before rebirth or final rest. These three realms are not isolated. They interpenetrate along the world tree. A bird nesting in the upper branches can carry messages from Prav to Yav. A snake coiled among the roots can carry secrets from Nav upward. Human beings, living in Yav, stand at the center and must maintain the flow between the levels, through ritual, through correct behavior, through respect for the unseen. When harmony is broken, when oaths are violated, when offerings are forgotten, the balance falters, and misfortune follows. Drought in the fields, illness in the home, chaos at the borders. This sense of constant tension runs through much of what we can reconstruct about Slavic thought. Some modern interpretations speak of a fundamental duality expressed in the figures of Belobog and Chernobog, the white god of light and good, pitted against the black god of darkness and evil. The names appear in a single late source, the 13th century chronicle of Helmold of Bosau, who attributes the idea to the pagan Slavs of the Baltic coast. They supposedly believed in two opposing principles, one benevolent and one malevolent, locked in eternal struggle. Yet, careful study has shown that this neat opposition is almost certainly a later construct, shaped by Christian dualism and perhaps influenced by reports of Zoroastrian ideas carried along trade routes. The older Slavic worldview does not appear to have framed existence as a simple battle between absolute good and absolute evil. Instead, opposition was more fluid, more cyclical. Light needs darkness to be seen. Order requires chaos to define itself. Summer must give way to winter so that spring can return. At the very origin of things stands Rod, a figure whose name means something close to kin, generation, or fate. Rod is the primordial creator, the source from which the world and all its orders emerge. In some late folklore, he is described as giving birth to the cosmos from himself, or as shaping the first people from clay or wood. Rod is not a distant sky father in the manner of Zeus or Odin. He is closer, more intimate, the root force of kinship and continuity. With him are the Rozhanitsi, the divine birth-givers, female beings who attend every human birth and spin the thread of each life's destiny. They are sometimes 3 in number, sometimes more, and their presence is felt not only at the moment of coming into the world, but throughout life, in the small rituals that mark marriage, harvest, and death. The Rozhanitsi do not judge, they simply weave what must be, their spindles turning in rhythm with the turning of the seasons. Together, Rod and the Rozhanitsi represent the generative power at the heart of the Slavic universe. They do not rule from a throne in Prav. They are the living pulse that runs through the trunk of the world tree itself. Their work ensures that life continues, that the dead return to nourish the living, that the wheel of time keeps turning, even when individual lives end. Standing beneath that imagined oak now, as the first birds begin to call and the sky lightens to a soft grey, you can almost feel the slow, steady breathing of this cosmos. It is vertical, yes, layered from crown to root, but it is also alive at every point. No part is truly separate from the others. The same sap that rises in spring from Nav through Yav to Prav will fall again in autumn leaves, returning to the soil. Order and chaos are not enemies here. They are partners in an endless dance. And yet that dance requires attention. The Slavs understood that human beings, placed at the middle level, bear a special responsibility. Neglect the ancestors in Nav, and the fields of Yav grow barren. Forget the laws of Prav, and storms tear the branches. The world tree does not enforce its balance with thunderous commands. It simply waits. When the connection weakens, the tree trembles, and the worlds draw closer in warning. As morning mist begins to lift from the meadow below the hill, the great tree seems to settle once more into stillness. Somewhere in its shade, perhaps, the first offerings of the day are being placed: a piece of bread, a cup of milk poured into the earth. Small acts, but necessary. They keep the flow moving, keep the realms in conversation. And from that quiet conversation between sky, soil, and the human heart, the greater gods will soon step forward first among them, the one whose voice rolls like distant thunder across the branches. High in the branches of that great world tree, where the first rays of morning strike the leaves and set them shimmering, the voice of thunder has always rolled. It is the sound of Perun, the one the Slavs called the Thunderer, the god whose name still echoes in the word for thunder itself across many Slavic languages. He stood at the summit of the divine order, the protector of oaths, the patron of princes and their warrior retinues, the enforcer of cosmic law when the balance between the realms began to slip. Perun was not a remote, abstract sovereign. He was immediate, present in every crack of lightning that split the summer sky, in every oak that stood tall and unbroken after a storm had passed. His sacred places were the highest points, hilltops, mountain ridges, ancient groves where no axe was allowed to fall, except in ritual. The oak was his tree above all others, its deep roots and spreading crown mirroring the world tree itself. Men swore oaths by striking weapons against oak trunks or by placing their right hands on them. Breaking such an oath invited Perun's wrath in the form of a bolt that could split stone. His weapon was most often a stone or metal axe, sometimes a club, sometimes simply the lightning itself. When the storm came, people said Perun was driving his chariot across the heavens, pursuing his eternal adversary, and the thunder was the wheels grinding against the clouds. In the summer of 980, on a high hill overlooking the Dnieper in Kiev, Prince Vladimir raised a wooden idol of Perun that became one of the most famous images of Slavic paganism before the coming of Christianity. The primary chronicle describes it plainly. The statue was made of wood, its head overlaid with silver, its mustache fashioned from gold. The eyes may have been set with stones or left as dark hollows. The sources do not say, but the overall effect was striking. This was no modest household figure. It was a public declaration of power. Warriors and boyars would have gathered there to offer cattle, to pour mead, to seek victory in coming campaigns. The idol stood beside the other gods Vladimir had assembled, but Perun occupied the central or foremost place, a visible sign that the prince placed his trust in the Thunderer above all. Yet Perun did not rule unchallenged. Down among the roots of the same world tree coiled his ancient opponent, Veles, also called Volos in some regions. Where Perun embodied the bright sky, the mountain peak, the ordered world of warriors and law, Veles belonged to the lower places, the damp earth, the shadowed forest, the hidden springs, the underworld of Nav. He was known as the cattle god, Dazhbog, because he guarded herds, ensured their increase, and protected the wealth measured in livestock that formed the backbone of early Slavic economy. But his domain reached much further. Veles was the lord of magic, of hidden knowledge, of poetry and incantation. He was the patron of merchants, of those who travelled dangerous roads, of those who needed cunning more than brute strength. Above all, he ruled the dead, and the riches that lay buried with them, gold, grain, the fertility waiting beneath the soil. In appearance, Veles was often imagined as a great serpent or dragon, his scales dark and glistening, dwelling at the base of the world tree, where the roots drink from subterranean waters. Sometimes he took the form of a horned man, or an old man with a long beard, or simply a shadow that moved where no shadow should be. Unlike Perun's straightforward might, Veles worked through subtlety. He could change shape, speak in riddles, grant visions in dreams. He was not evil in the absolute sense. He was necessary. Without him, the cattle would not multiply, the grain would not sprout, the rivers would not flow. Yet his actions repeatedly disrupted the surface order, and that disruption called Perun down from the heights. The central myth of Slavic paganism, the one that appears in fragments across folklore, in Christian polemics, in the structure of seasonal rituals, tells of their unending confrontation. In its most widespread form, Veles steals what belongs to the upper world. Sometimes it is cattle, the herds that graze in Yav and provide milk, meat, leather, and sacrifice. Sometimes it is a woman, the wife of the sun god, or a mortal maiden whose beauty represents fertility itself. In other versions it is water, or rain, or the very life force of the fields. Veles takes these things down into Nav, hiding them in caves, beneath roots, behind locked gates of stone or water. The world above begins to wither. Cows go dry, crops fail, rivers shrink to trickles, women cease to bear children. Drought settles over the land like a heavy cloak. Perun cannot ignore this theft. He leaves his mountain seat, mounts his chariot, or simply strides forth with axe in hand. The chase begins. Veles flees, twisting through forest and swamp, diving into rivers, burrowing beneath hills. Perun pursues, striking with lightning, splitting trees, shattering rocks. Each bolt is a blow aimed at the serpent, each peal of thunder a shout of challenge. The battle rages across the sky and earth, until at last Perun corners his foe. The final strike lands, the axe falls, the lightning pierces, and Veles is wounded or slain. From the wound, or from the sky opened by the thunder, rain pours down in torrents. The stolen cattle return, the rivers swell, the fields drink deeply, green shoots push through the cracked soil. Life resumes its rhythm. This is not a story of final victory. Veles does not die forever. He retreats, heals, waits. The next drought will come, the next theft will occur, and Perun will ride out again. The myth repeats, with every storm season, with every cycle of dry summer giving way to autumn rains. It is the same pattern that governs the world tree: tension between the upper and lower realms, disruption followed by restoration, death followed by rebirth. Perun's triumph is temporary but essential. Veles's defeat is never complete, but always necessary for renewal. Together they keep the wheel turning. In daily life, this opposition shaped how people understood their world. A shepherd whose flock prospered might thank Veles quietly, pouring a little milk at the threshold or leaving a coin in the earth. A warrior preparing for battle would turn to Perun, touching an oak or raising an axe to the sky. Farmers watched the clouds with both hope and caution. Too long without rain, and Veles was holding back what he had taken. When the storm finally broke, they knew Perun had won the day. Even the calendar reflected the struggle. Certain spring and summer rituals involved driving cattle between two fires to protect them from Veles's influence, or climbing hills to make offerings to Perun for good weather. The myth also carried a deeper recognition of duality within human nature. Perun represented the ideal of the warrior elite: strength, honor, direct action, loyalty to the prince and the community. Veles spoke to the other side: the cunning merchant, the poet who finds words in silence, the healer who works with herbs and charms, the mourner who speaks to the dead. Both were needed. A society ruled only by Perun would be rigid and brittle. One ruled only by Veles would dissolve into chaos. Their conflict kept the balance alive. As the morning light strengthens and the imagined oak casts a long shadow across the dew-wet grass, you can almost hear the low rumble far off on the horizon, not a threat, but a reminder. Somewhere in the upper branches, Perun sharpens his axe. Somewhere among the roots, Veles coils tighter, patient, waiting for his moment. Their struggle is not noise for its own sake. It is the heartbeat of the world: contraction, release, drought, flood, winter, spring. Without it, the tree would stand motionless, the realms disconnected, life suspended. And yet even this great opposition is only part of the story. Beyond the thunder and the serpent, other lights begin to move across the sky, steady, warm, life-giving. The sun itself has its own guardians, its own lineage, its own quiet power that sustains the world between the storms. After the storm has passed, and the last echoes of thunder have rolled away into silence, the sky clears to reveal the steady arc of the sun moving across it. For the ancient Slavs, this daily journey was never taken for granted. The light and warmth that followed the rain were gifts, actively given by powers higher than the clouds themselves. These powers had names and lineages of their own, a solar family whose influence reached deep into every aspect of life, from the forging of tools to the ripening of grain. They were not distant or abstract. They were the quiet, constant presence that made survival possible through long winters and short summers. At the head of this line stands Svarog, the celestial smith, the god of heavenly fire. His name appears in the primary chronicle among the gods of Vladimir's pantheon, though his role there is brief and somewhat overshadowed. Older traditions, preserved in fragments of folklore and in the etymology of related words across Slavic languages, paint him as the original craftsman of the cosmos. Svarog is the one who kindled the first fire in the sky, who hammered the sun into shape on his anvil, who forged the stars and set them in their courses. He is closely linked to the idea of Svar, the bright, clear vault of heaven, and his domain is the purifying, creative flame that comes from above, rather than from the hearth below. Comparisons with other Indo-European traditions place him alongside figures like the Greek Hephaestus or the Vedic Tvastar, a divine blacksmith whose work orders the world. Some scholars suggest that in an earlier period, before Perun rose to prominence among the warrior elite, Svarog may have held a position closer to Supreme Creator, the Father from whom other gods descended. By the time of the Kievan pantheon in the 10th century, however, his role had shifted toward that of an ancestral figure, the progenitor whose legacy lived on in his sons. He was not often the direct recipient of public sacrifices or oaths. His power was felt indirectly, in the heat of the forge, in the spark that starts a new fire, in the clarity of a bright day after clouds have parted. One of his most direct manifestations was Svarogich, literally son of Svarog, but understood as the sacred fire itself. Among the Polabian Slavs living along the Baltic coast, Svarogich had a prominent cult center in the temple city of Rethra, also called Radogosts or Radogost. German chroniclers, including Thietmar of Merseburg and Adam of Bremen, described Rethra as a fortified sanctuary surrounded by woods and lakes, its central temple housing idols of multiple gods. Svarogich stood there as a living flame kept burning on an altar, tended by priests who interpreted its behavior, whether it burned steadily, flared suddenly, or died down as omens for the community. Warriors departing for battle would take embers from this fire to carry into war, believing it held the protective essence of the god. When the flame was extinguished, it was carefully rekindled from the same source, preserving continuity. This cult of perpetual fire underscores how central the idea of celestial flame was to Slavic religious life. Not wild or destructive, but controlled, enduring, essential. From Svarog descends Dazhbog, whose name means the giving god or the bestower. The primary chronicle lists him directly as the son of Svarog, and his role is clear. He is the sun at its zenith, the generous provider of light, warmth, and abundance. Dazhbog was invoked in blessings for good harvests, for healthy children, for prosperity in trade and cattle. In folk songs collected centuries later, he appears as the grandfather of the Russian people. "We are Dazhbog's grandsons," says the text of the Tale of Igor's Campaign, a 12th century epic suggesting that in some traditions he was seen as the mythic ancestor of the entire community. His daily passage across the sky was the guarantee that life would continue. He rises in the east full of promise, reaches his peak at noon, pouring out blessings, then descends gently into the west, leaving the world in twilight rest before returning at dawn. Dazhbog's generosity was not passive. He actively gave not only light, but the fruits that light makes possible. Bread rising in the oven, milk from the cow, the golden color of ripe wheat, all were traces of his favor. When the sun shone steadily through the growing season, people understood that Dazhbog was pleased. When clouds lingered too long or drought set in, they feared he had turned his face away, perhaps drawn into the old struggle with the forces below. Another solar deity shares the sky with him, Khors, whose name likely derives from an Iranian root meaning radiant or shining. His presence in Vladimir's pantheon points to cultural contacts between the East Slavs and steppe peoples Khazars. Alans, perhaps even earlier Scythian or Sarmatian influences, who carried solar worship across the Pontic steppe. Khors is most often identified with the solar disk itself, the visible orb of the sun, rather than its warming rays or generative power. Some interpretations place him as the god of the sun's movement, of its measured path across the heavens, ensuring the regularity of days and seasons. In a few late sources and folk beliefs, Khors appears linked to the moon or to cycles of waxing and waning. But the dominant view ties him firmly to daylight and the bright face of the sun at noon. These four figures, Svarog the smith, Svarog the sacred flame, Dazhbog the generous giver, Khors the shining disk, together form a coherent solar lineage. They represent different facets of the same essential force, fire and light as the source of order, growth, and wealth. Fire was not merely useful, it was divine. The hearth fire in every home was a small reflection of Svarog. The sun's heat ripening the crops was Dazhbog's open hand. The steady wheel of day and night was Khors turning the sky. The spark that first taught humans to shape metal was Svarog's original gift. In practice, this meant that solar reverence touched everyday routines. Before kindling the morning fire, a woman might speak a quiet word of thanks or make the sign of the cross over the hearth, even after Christianization had arrived. At midsummer, when the sun reached its highest point, people gathered on hills to watch it set slowly, sometimes rolling burning wheels down slopes as symbols of the sun's journey. Harvest festivals included offerings of the first sheaf or the last loaf, acknowledging that the grain had been touched by Dazhbog's rays. Blacksmiths, working with fire and iron, enjoyed a special status. Their craft was seen as an echo of Svarog's primordial labor. The multiplicity of these solar deities shows how the Slavs approached the sun not as a single entity, but as a living process with many aspects. Light was life, warmth was wealth, regularity was safety. To lose the sun's favor was to face darkness, cold, hunger. Yet the sun always returned. Even on the shortest winter day, when shadows stretched long and the cold bit deep, people knew the light would strengthen again. That promise was woven into their understanding of the world. As the imagined dawn mist finally burns away under the strengthening rays, the great oak stands bathed in gold. The branches that only moments ago held the memory of thunder now catch the steady light, each leaf a small mirror reflecting the sky. In that quiet illumination, the solar gods move on their eternal course, giving without demand, sustaining without fanfare. Their gifts flow downward through the tree, warming the earth, quickening the roots, reminding every living thing that after storm comes calm, after night comes day. And in the villages below, as smoke begins to rise from chimneys and children run out into the fields, another presence stirs softer, closer to the soil, tied to the turning spindle and the cradle's rock. The feminine powers that cradle life itself are waiting to be remembered next. In the villages beneath the great oak, as the sun climbs higher and the fields begin to stir with the day's work, attention turns downward to the soil underfoot, to the cradle rocking gently, to the steady rhythm of a spindle turning wool into thread. Here the divine feminine holds sway, not with thunder or blazing light, but with the patient, enduring strength that keeps life rooted and renewing. These goddesses and their attendant spirits were closer to everyday existence than many of the sky gods. They watched over the home, the birth chamber, the loom, the garden. Their presence was felt in small, constant ways, a woman's hands shaping dough, a mother singing to her newborn, the damp earth yielding after rain. The most prominent among them, the only female deity named in Vladimir's pantheon of 980, was Mokosh. Her name appears in the primary chronicle alongside Perun, Dazhbog, and the others, yet her domain sets her apart. Mokosh was the goddess of the earth itself, moist, fertile, nurturing, and of everything that grows from it or depends on it. She governed spinning and weaving, the arts that clothed the family, and provided the thread of continuity from one generation to the next. Women prayed to her while working at the loom, offering drops of water or strands of wool so that the cloth would be strong and the household protected. She was also the patroness of women in general. Midwives invoked her during difficult births. Young brides sought her blessing for children. Older women turned to her when illness came to the home. Mokosh's connection to moisture was central. She was linked to springs, to dew, to the dampness that makes soil fruitful after a dry spell. In some regions, folk beliefs described her as a tall woman with long arms, walking the fields at night to check on the crops, or as a figure who sat by wells and rivers, combing her hair with a golden comb. Sacrifices to her were simple and domestic. A piece of bread placed in the corner of the house, a handful of grain buried at the threshold, a sheep's fleece left out under the full moon. Unlike the public idols on the Kiev hill, her worship remained largely in the home and the women's quarters, carried on quietly even after Christianity arrived. Among the Polabian Slavs farther west, another goddess of life appears in the records. Helmold of Bosau, writing in the 12th century, mentions Jiva, or Siwa, whom he describes as the goddess of life and vitality. Her name derives from the root meaning living or alive, and she was honored in sacred groves and at springs where the water was believed to carry her healing power. Jiva represented the animating force in all growing things, the green shoot pushing through soil, the breath in a newborn's lungs, the pulse that keeps the seasons turning. Her cult was tied to renewal after winter, and offerings of milk or eggs were left to ensure her continued favor. Though less documented than Mokosh, Jiva's presence among the Western Slavs shows how the idea of life-giving femininity varied across regions while remaining a constant thread. The theme of fate and destiny brings us to the Rozhenitsy, the birth-givers, and their specific attendants, Dolya and Nedolya. The Rozhenitsy were a group of female beings, sometimes 3, sometimes more, who appeared at every birth to determine the course of the child's life. They were imagined as old women or young maidens sitting beside the cradle, spinning or measuring the thread of fate. One might decree long life and good fortune, another hardship, a third an early end. Their judgment was final, no appeal was possible. In some tales they arrive on the 3rd night after birth, when the household has quieted, and speak their verdict in low voices. Dolya and Nedolya personify this duality most clearly. Dolya means portion or share, the good fate, the lucky thread. She is the one who grants prosperity, a kind husband, healthy children, a long and peaceful old age. Nedolya is her opposite, misfortune, poverty, illness, untimely death. Together they represent the inescapable truth that life is a mixture of both. No one receives only gifts or only trials. The two are woven together. In later folklore, after Christianization, these figures sometimes merged with images of guardian angels or even the Virgin Mary, but their original role was stark and impartial. They did not reward virtue or punish vice. They simply assigned what must be. Another pair often mentioned in connection with love and marriage are Lada and Lelia, or Lado and Lado. Their names appear in wedding songs, spring rituals, and folk incantations collected in the 18th and 19th centuries. Lada is invoked as the goddess of harmony, beauty, and marital bliss. Lelia as her daughter or sister, associated with youthful love and courtship. Couples would circle a sacred tree or fire while singing refrains that called on them for a happy union and many children. Yet careful examination of the sources shows that Lada and Lelia are likely late developments or reconstructions. They do not appear in the early chronicles or in the accounts of foreign observers. Their prominence grows in 19th century Romantic folklore studies, where scholars sometimes projected them backward as full goddesses of love. Still, their enduring place in oral tradition in lullabies, in harvest dances, in the rituals of Ivan Kupala night speaks to a deep cultural need for figures who bless the joining of lives and the continuation of the family line. Across these figures runs a single quiet truth. The feminine principle in Slavic belief was tied to the earth, to birth, and to the unyielding thread of fate. These were not goddesses of war or sky or abstract law. They were the foundation on which everything else rested. The fields would not yield without Mokosh's moisture, Children would not come without the Rozhanitsi's decree. Homes would not hold together without the daily labor that Lada's name came to symbolize. Their power was understated, but unbreakable. When storms raged and thunder rolled, people looked to Perun for protection. When the sun shone and crops grew, they thanked Dazhbog. But when life itself needed sustaining through birth, through loss, through the long turning of years, it was the feminine powers who were closest. As the day advances and shadows shorten across the meadow, imagine a woman stepping out from the house with a spindle in hand. She sits on a low bench in the sun, drawing out the wool, twisting it into even thread. The motion is slow, deliberate, almost meditative. Each turn of the spindle adds length to the yarn. Each completed skein will become part of a shirt, a blanket, a shroud. In that simple act, she continues the work of Mokosh, honors the Rozhanitsi, carries forward the quiet strength that has kept her people rooted through centuries of change. The thread runs on, unbroken. And as that thread stretches into the afternoon light, the world around the home grows more crowded with presences, not gods of thunder or sun, but spirits that share the hearth, the forest, the riverbank. They are nearer still, watching from corners and shadows, waiting to be acknowledged. As the afternoon deepens and the imagined oak gives way to a different landscape, the open, salt-heavy air of the Baltic coast, the focus shifts to the westernmost Slavs, those who lived along the southern shores of the Baltic Sea. These were the Palabian and Pomeranian tribes, often called the Baltic Slavs, whose lands stretched from the mouth of the Elbe to the Vistula. Here, far from the steppes and river cities of the east, paganism developed in a different direction. Temples of wood and stone rose in fortified centers. Priests maintained organized cults, and idols took on elaborate, multi-faced forms that have no direct parallel in the simpler wooden figures of Kievan Rus. This was the most architecturally and iconographically advanced expression of Slavic religion, a world of structured sanctuaries that stood defiant against both the sea and the advancing Christian armies. The island of Rugen, known to the Slavs as Ruyen, became the final stronghold. Its chalk cliffs and dense forests sheltered the most famous of these centers, Arkona, the chief stronghold of the Rani tribe. Arkona was not just a settlement, it was a sacred precinct, a place where the old faith was defended to the last. At its heart stood the temple of Svetovit, also called Svantavit or Swantavit, the four-faced god who presided over prophecy, abundance, and war. The chronicler Saxo Grammaticus, writing in the early 13th century, but drawing on earlier eyewitness accounts, left the most detailed description. The temple itself was built of wood, skillfully carved, with a roof supported by 4 columns. Inside stood the statue of Svetovit, a tall wooden figure with 4 heads facing the 4 cardinal directions, each face bearded and stern. In his right hand he held a drinking horn, in his left a bow. A saddle and bridle hung beside him, symbols of his readiness for battle and journey. The most striking element of the cult was the white horse kept in the temple enclosure. This horse was sacred to Svetovit and used for divination. Priests would lead it across a row of crossed spears laid on the ground. If the horse stepped over the spears with its right foot first, the omen was favorable for war, for harvest, for any undertaking. The priests also filled the god's horn with mead each year and observed how much evaporated by morning. A low level foretold scarcity, a full horn promised plenty. These rituals were public and precise, carried out by a dedicated priesthood that held considerable influence over tribal decisions. Svetovit was no distant deity. He was consulted before major campaigns, and his answers shaped the course of events for the Rani and their allies. This elaborate system could not survive the pressure from outside. In the summer of 1168, a Danish force under King Valdemar I and Bishop Absalon of Roskilde landed on Rugen. After a siege, Arkona fell. Saxo Grammaticus, who was present, recorded the moment. The Danes entered the temple, toppled the statue of Svetovit, and carried it outside. The god's four faces looked out over the sea, one last time before the idol was broken apart and burned. The white horse was killed, the sacred horn emptied, the temple dismantled. The fall of Arkona is often seen as the symbolic end of organized Slavic paganism in the West. The Rani were forcibly baptized, their sanctuaries destroyed or converted, their priests silenced. What had been a living cult center became a memory preserved only in Christian chronicles. Farther inland, in the city of Stettin, another multi-headed deity held sway, Triglav, the three-headed god. His temple was described by the chronicler Herbord in the early 12th century. The statue of Triglav had 3 heads joined at the neck, and a veil of gold covered his eyes and mouth. The priests explained that the covering symbolized the god's mastery over the 3 realms, Prav, Yav, and Nav, and his unwillingness to reveal too much to mortal sight or speech. Triglav was invoked as a protector of the city, a witness to oaths, and a guide through the hidden connections between worlds. When Christian missionaries arrived, they found the cult still strong. The statue was eventually removed, but local resistance delayed full conversion for decades. In Rethra, the same temple city already mentioned for its sacred fire, the chief deity was Radagast, sometimes identified with Svarog, the son of Svarog. Radagast was the god of hospitality, of guests and strangers, but also of war and righteous anger against oathbreakers. His idol stood in a richly decorated temple, surrounded by other divine figures, and his cult involved feasts where strangers were welcomed and protected under his name. The temple's wealth, gold, silver, embroidered cloths, drew the attention of raiders and missionaries alike. Alongside these major figures stood a group of martial gods, Jarovit, Yarovit, Porovit, and Ruavit. Each was depicted with multiple faces and armed with numerous swords or axes. Jarovit was honored in spring festivals as a god of young growth and youthful vigor, sometimes equated with warlike energy. Porovit and Ruavit appear in the same accounts, their names linked to strength and destruction. Their multi-faced, heavily armed images reflect the constant threat faced by these coastal tribes from neighboring Saxons, Danes, and later Poles and Germans. The gods mirrored the needs of their people: vigilance in all directions, readiness for battle, protection of the hearth and guest. What sets the Baltic Slavs apart is the degree of organization and elaboration. While Eastern Slavs built wooden idols on open hills and conducted rituals in groves, the Western Slavs constructed enclosed temples, maintained priesthoods, used divination tools, and created complex iconography. The multi-headed statues were not mere decoration. They expressed the god's ability to see and act in multiple realms simultaneously. This sophistication made their religion a formidable cultural system, one that resisted Christianization longer than most. As the wind carries the scent of pine and seawater across the low hills of Rugen, imagine the ruined outline of Arkona's temple still visible against the horizon. The 4 faces of Svetovit are gone, the white horse long vanished, yet the place retains a quiet weight. These Western gods spoke through carved wood and measured steps, through the flicker of temple fires and the low murmur of priests. Their world was structured, visible, defended, and therefore vulnerable when the tide of change finally reached the shore. In their passing, something vivid and intricate was lost, leaving only echoes carried on the same restless Baltic wind. With the sun now low in the western sky, and the first evening shadows stretching across the fields, the great oak and the distant temples fade into the background. Closer to hand, inside the low wooden houses and around their yards, another layer of the Slavic world comes alive. This is the domain of the lower spirits beings that were never raised to the status of gods in grand pantheons, but were far more immediate, more constant in daily experience. They inhabited the thresholds, the hearths, the barns, the bathhouses, the forests, the rivers. Ordinary people dealt with them directly, without priests or elaborate temples. These encounters were practical, sometimes tense, always negotiated. The world of the Slavs was thick with such presences. Ignoring them invited trouble, acknowledging them brought uneasy peace. The most familiar and most intimate was the domovoi, the house spirit, the master of the home. Every dwelling had one, an unseen guardian who lived behind the stove, under the threshold, or in the attic. He appeared in dreams or glimpses as a small old man with a beard, sometimes covered in fur like an animal, sometimes wearing the clothes of the household head. The domovoi protected the family, the livestock, the stored grain, but only if treated with respect. A bowl of milk or porridge left near the stove at night, a whispered, "Good evening, master." When entering the house, a clean hearth, these kept him content. If offended by neglect, by swearing in the home, by moving without invitation, he could turn spiteful, rattle pots, pinch sleepers, drive cattle mad, or even set small fires. When a family relocated, they took care to invite him along. They might carry embers from the old stove in a pot, or sweep the floor and pour the sweepings into a sack, saying, "Come with us, grandfather, to the new house." Leaving him behind meant starting over without protection. Out beyond the fence lay the forest, governed by the leshy. The leshy was the spirit of the woods, tall and thin, with skin like tree bark, hair and beard of moss, eyes that glowed like coals. He could appear as a man, as a whirlwind, as a herd of animals moving together. He knew every path, every hollow, every mushroom patch. To travellers he could be generous or cruel. A lost wanderer might meet him and receive directions if he removed his hat in greeting, if he spoke politely, if he left a small offering of bread or tobacco. But the leshy also loved to lead people astray. He would confuse trails, make familiar roads loop back on themselves, fill the air with laughter or animal cries. Hunters and herders who entered deep woods carried salt or a knife turned backward in the belt as protection. The leshy was not evil by nature. He guarded his domain against overuse. Cut too many trees without asking, hunt out of season, or boast of your skill and he would punish. Feed his creatures or leave the first catch for him, and he might allow safe passage. Water had its own rulers. The Vodianoi, the water spirit, lived in rivers, lakes, mills, and wells. He was imagined as an old man with green beard of algae, skin cold and slimy, sometimes with a fish-tail or frog-like features. He owned the fish, the drowned souls, the sunken treasures. Millers poured vodka or bread into the water to keep him friendly, so that the wheel turned smoothly. Fishermen left the first catch or a coin at the bank. If displeased, the Vodianoi dragged people under, tangled nets, flooded banks. His daughters or wives were the rusalki, not mermaids in the Western sense, but spirits of young women who had died by water, usually suicides or those drowned before marriage. They appeared beautiful, with long pale hair, pale skin, singing soft songs on the banks during Rusalka week in late spring or early summer. They danced in circles, lured men into the water to tickle them to death or drown them out of envy or revenge. Yet in some beliefs, Rusalki also brought fertility. They blessed fields, near rivers, ensured good rains. People avoided swimming alone during their week and left offerings of cloth or ribbons on branches to placate them. The banya, the steam bath, had its own dangerous inhabitant, the bannock. The bathhouse stood apart from the main dwelling, a small dark building where heat and steam cleansed body and soul. The bannock lived under the benches or behind the stove. He was small, hairy, sometimes with iron hands or a tail. Bathing was ritual naked, in darkness or dim light, with birch branches, and the bannock watched. He liked the steam, the smell of soap, the sound of water hissing on stones. A polite visitor poured water for him, left soap or a switch, spoke respectfully. An unwelcome intruder, someone who bathed too late, alone, or with bad intentions, might be scolded, beaten with branches, or suffocated by steam. Women giving birth sometimes used the banya. The bannock could help or hinder depending on the offerings. Other figures crowded the edges of perception. Kikimora, a female house spirit, lived behind the stove or in the swamp. If treated well, she helped with spinning and housework. If not, she made noise at night, broke things, tangled thread. Poludnitsa, the midday spirit, appeared as a beautiful woman in white in the fields at noon. She asked riddles, failed to answer, and she struck with sunstroke or madness. She guarded growing crops and punished those who worked too hard under the hot sun. These spirits were not abstractions. They were neighbors, touchy, powerful, necessary. The Slavic peasant did not worship them in temples. He bargained with them daily. A pinch of salt thrown over the shoulder, a whispered formula before entering the forest, a small gift left at the water's edge. These were contracts. Break them, and misfortune followed. Honor them, and life went smoother. The world was not empty space between human settlements. It was populated, watchful, responsive. Every corner held a presence that demanded recognition. As night settles over the village, and the hearth fire flickers low, casting long shadows on the walls, the domovoi stirs behind the stove. Outside, the leshy rustles in the dark tree line, the rusalki murmur by the river. They have always been there, closer than the gods, more persistent than any idol. In their quiet insistence lies the deepest layer of the old belief, the conviction that nothing is truly alone, that the mundane is laced with the unseen, and that survival depends on learning how to live alongside it. As the hearth fire dies down to embers, and the house spirits settle into watchful silence, the long night brings the final chapter of the story, not an abrupt ending, but a slow fading and unexpected persistence. The old faith did not vanish the moment the first cross was raised over a Slavic village. It retreated, adapted, hid in plain sight, and in places even fought back. What we call Christianization was not a single event, but a process that stretched from the 8th to the 12th century, taking different shapes in different regions, sometimes gentle, often violent, always incomplete. Among the southern Slavs, the transition began earliest and in many ways most peacefully. In the 9th century, the brothers, Cyril and Methodius, sent from Byzantium, created the Glagolitic alphabet to translate scripture into Old Church Slavonic, a language close enough to the spoken dialects that ordinary people could understand it. Their mission to Great Moravia, and later to Bulgaria, laid the groundwork for Slavic literacy and liturgy. Christianity arrived here as a cultural tool rather than a foreign imposition. It carried the prestige of the empire and allowed local elites to join the wider Christian world without entirely erasing their own tongue or customs. Resistance existed, but it was scattered. The new faith spread through monasteries, schools, and royal courts, gradually overlaying, rather than uprooting the older layer. For the East Slavs, the turning point came later and more dramatically. In 988, Prince Vladimir of Kiev, after weighing alliances with different faiths, chose Byzantine Christianity. The primary chronicle tells the story in stages. Vladimir sends envoys to observe Muslim, Jewish, Latin, and Greek rites. The Greeks impress him most with their liturgy and icons. He orders mass baptism in the Dnieper, has the idols of Perun and the others thrown into the river, beaten with rods as they float downstream. The chronicle frames this as a decisive break. Yet archaeology and later texts show it was anything but. Wooden idols continued to appear in remote areas for generations. Rural priests complained that peasants still sacrificed to Perun under the name of the prophet Elijah, whose fiery chariot in the sky recalled the thunder god's ride. Vladimir's baptism was political. It secured Byzantine recognition, a marriage alliance, military aid. But on the ground, the change was gradual and partial. In the West, the process was bloodier and more protracted. Poland accepted Christianity in 966, when Mieszko I was baptized, likely under pressure from the Holy Roman Empire, and to secure his position against pagan neighbors. The conversion was top-down, enforced by dukes and bishops, but pagan practices lingered in the countryside. The 11th century saw several uprisings led by priests and tribal leaders who rallied around the old gods. Chroniclers record revolts in which churches were burned, priests killed, and attempts made to restore the old order. These rebellions were crushed, but they show that acceptance was never unanimous. The Baltic Slavs resisted longest. As we saw with Arkona, in 1168, their fortified temples and organized priesthoods made them a military as well as a religious target. The Northern Crusades, waged by Danes, Saxons, Poles, framed the destruction of pagan sanctuaries as holy war. By the early 13th century, the last independent Slavic pagan polities had fallen. Yet even here the old rites did not disappear overnight. They went underground or blended into local Christian customs. What emerged across all these regions was a phenomenon unique in its depth and duration: dvorvery, the double faith. People did not simply abandon one system for another, they fused them. Perun's attributes, thunder, oak, mountain, transferred to Saint Elijah, whose feast day on July 20 often coincided with summer storms, and whose legends include riding across the sky in a fiery chariot. Veles, protector of cattle and wealth, merged with Saint Vlasi, Blaze, whose patronage of livestock made the link natural. In some areas he also blended with Saint Nicholas, the wonder worker associated with commerce and hidden treasures. Mokosh's spinning, weaving, and guardianship of women found a counterpart in Paraskeva Pyatnitsa, Saint Paraskeva of Friday, whose icons show her holding a spindle and whose day was marked by strict taboos on women's work, echoes of older prohibitions. Seasonal festivals underwent similar transformations. The spring rites of Maslenitsa, with their blini pancakes symbolizing the sun and their bonfires, preserved elements of older solar and farewell to winter customs, perhaps linked to Komoyeditsa, the bear festival. Ivan Kupala night in midsummer, jumping over fires, floating wreaths on rivers. Gathering herbs at dawn combined Christian commemoration of John the Baptist's birth with pre-Christian solstice celebrations of fertility, water, and fire. Churches might condemn these practices, but priests often participated or turned a blind eye. The result was a layered religion in which the old and new coexisted, sometimes in tension, sometimes in harmony. This synthesis ensured that Slavic mythology did not die out. It survived in fairy tales collected by Afanasiev in the 19th century, in Bylini epics sung by Skomoroki, in proverbs, charms, and calendar customs. Romantic scholars of that era, the brothers' Grimm's Slavic counterparts, began systematically recording folklore, seeing in it fragments of ancient belief. Composers drew on the material. Rimsky-Korsakov's operas, The Snow Maiden, Sadko, and Kashche the Immortal, brought gods, spirits, and mythic motifs to the stage. Painters and writers revived images of Baba Yaga, the Leshy, the Rusalki. Even Soviet-era literature and film occasionally used pagan archetypes under the guise of national heritage. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a revival movement appeared, Rodnovery, or native faith. Groups in Russia, Ukraine, Poland, and elsewhere reconstruct rituals, build small altars to Perun or Mokosh, celebrate Kupala and Kolyada. Some approaches are scholarly and reconstructive, others blend nationalism, environmentalism, or New Age elements. Academic opinion varies. Some see it as legitimate cultural recovery, others as modern invention dressed in archaic clothes. What is clear is that the interest exists and grows, fed by the same sense of continuity that kept the old ways alive through centuries of official Christianity. Slavic mythology never required a single sacred text or an unbroken priesthood to endure. It lived in stories told by the fire, in gestures made at crossroads, in the rhythm of the seasons. When the idols fell and the temples burned, the structure changed, but the underlying patterns persisted, disguised, diluted, yet recognizable. Even now, when a coin is left by a spring, or a quiet protective phrase is spoken in the forest, something older moves beneath the surface of habit and language. Beneath the noise of the modern world, under the same night sky that once arched above sacred groves and wooden idols, the echoes remain in thunder, in wind through the trees, in water flowing through dark earth, not as gods waiting to return, but as memory embedded in culture itself.